we'll start. Okay. So I'm going to make a start because we were a few minutes late because I had a problem with my connection at the last minute. So welcome to this webinar on mediating learning and dynamic assessment. My name is Rachael Green. And I'm going to say right from the outset, I know dynamic assessment is of huge interest to everyone. And I was just saying to Nicole and Sarah, there's a limit to what you can discuss and cover in dynamic assessment in 20 minutes. So this isn't going to be a beginner's guide. This is going to be, I'm aiming this session at EPs or trainee EPs or those of you who have got some experience of using dynamic assessment in your practice. So, and I'll tell you exactly what we're going to focus on. I just need to say before I forget, if you've got questions, if there's anything you want to ask, use the Q&A button. You can put questions to me there and I will try and address some of them at the end. Okay, so I said this was aimed at EPs or people, trainees or teachers who have got some experience of using dynamic assessment. So first of all, just to let you know what we're going to focus on. So I'm going to talk to you today about 2 tools that you could use, I hope, to guide your practice to think about mediation in your dynamic assessment practice. So I'm going to talk to you about what I call the what, why, where model to focus on mediation skills, key mediation skills. And I'm also going to share with you an evaluation tool that you could use to evaluate your own practice, your own mediation that you're using in DA. And the idea is that, you know, the mediation aspect of dynamic assessment is something that needs practice. So these are supposed to be tools that you can use to sort of develop your practice, using your practice reflections to be able to bring your confidence and your competence at using mediation on further. And they're tried and tested tools that I've used with others who know a bit about DA. And you know, where can you use these? Well, they're something that I think can apply to any of the dynamic assessment tools that you might be using. So rather than talk about specific DA tools, hopefully these are something that you can use across practice, whatever you're using, whatever tools that you've had training in. But actually something like the what, why, where model is something that you can use beyond just your dynamic assessment practice. You can use it through using it in observations of others, and you can certainly use it with teaching staff, parents, to help them think about their interactions and how they mediate children's learning more generally and more widely. So just before I kick off and talk about those, just to sort of give you some context, you know, who am I and what's my experience? I am trained as an EP 20 years or more ago now, and I did the old master's course, and we had half a day's training on dynamic assessment, which was not nearly adequate to make you feel confident and competent to go out there in the world and use it. But it was enough to get me hooked and get me interested. And I remember thinking, yeah, this is why I wanted to be an EP. This is about working with individual children, finding out what's right for them. And I've been really lucky. It's been a bit of an obsession ever since, I'd say. I've got a huge bookshelf over there full of books on DA. I've studied it it was the subject of my professional doctorate, where I tried to develop a competency framework to use in practice. So a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about today will come from that work. And also I'm a tutor at the Tavistock Clinic, so working with trainees there. So again, you know, try to sort of develop a model of dynamic assessment training for the trainees there, and colleagues I work with at Southampton as well. We've tried to develop the training because I'm really passionate about people using this. It's such a useful tool, and you know, it can transform your assessment practice. And I just want people to feel confident and competent in using dynamic assessment, and you know, recognizing it's quite hard to get training in the approach. So some tools that will help you, hopefully. And in all the kind of training that I do and my travels with dynamic assessment, the thing that I think I get asked about most is mediation. You know, how can I do it? People often lack confidence with it. It's very common, and I think, you know, it's the most, in my opinion, the most, you know, sort of crucial aspect. It's the defining feature of dynamic assessment, this interaction. The idea is that through that interaction, that is how children develop their thinking and their learning skills. That's how their cognitive skills develop, through having, you know, meaningful interactions, purposeful interactions with the people around them. And, you know, I say it's the defining feature of dynamic assessment. It's also a thing that makes it most different from most other forms of assessment that we use. You know, we're very conditioned to, you know, if we're using a standardized assessment, not interact, not go beyond the script or the manual, not deviate from what we know. And I think that's one of the problems. Thinking about dynamic assessment in line with standardized assessment doesn't help us, because actually the skills that we need as practitioners are much more in line with how we would use a therapeutic approach. Our therapeutic skills, you know, are kind of much more at play, because this is such an individual approach where we're really trying to get inside the child's head and think, how are they learning? How are they thinking about this? That's our job as a mediator. And when we've done that, to think about, and how can I bring that learning on to the next step? How can I prompt a different thought? You know, and those are skills that you would use if you were using something like CBT. And how do you become good at something like CBT? Well, you need a really good knowledge of the theory that it's come from, what you're trying to aim for, and you need lots of opportunities to have sort of supervised and reflective practice, to be able to record the work that you've done and reflect on it, to see, you know, where your skills are developing, where you might need to develop further, and develop that kind of professional confidence, those clinical skills, that professional judgment that means that you can be responsive within an assessment situation. Okay, so there's my general thoughts on mediation and dynamic assessment. I've got a few slides to share with you, because I just said to you that I think one of the kind of key sort of aspects that we need to think about is making sure that we're clear on the theory behind mediation. I'm not going to spend lots of time talking to you about the theory now. I'm assuming that you know a little bit about it, but just to be really clear where I'm coming from and where these tools have come from, we've got kind of two sort of key players in the field of mediation, you know, where this theory of interaction and its impact on cognitive development and thinking came from. And the kind of godfather and originator, you know, in my opinion, is Vygotsky, and the work that he introduced and whilst he didn't sort of package his theory around mediation in a very neat way, it certainly was central sort of tenet to his theme. And he talks about tools becoming mediators of our thinking, such as language. There might be physical tools that we use to help our thinking, but mainly humans interacting with children and bringing their thinking on that way. And lots of the theory that Vygotsky came up with isn't very current and present, I don't think, in UK, certainly EP practice. A lot of his theory has been sort of taken forward by the kind of social learning theorists, Bruner, people like that, talking about scaffolding. There's lots to offer us in terms of thinking about mediation from that theory. But what I think people will be most familiar with is the work of Feuerstein. So if you're using David Zuriel's tests, if you've had training in the CAP, if you're using any of the LPAD tests, like the complex figure drawing, the organisation 16-word memory, those have all come from the work of Feuerstein. You know, they're all kind of informed by mediated learning experience theory, which came from Feuerstein. And you've got to remember that a lot of this theory to us now is quite common sense. You know, Feuerstein was writing at a time 50, 60 years ago when the commonly held belief was that cognitive skill, learning was genetically determined. Or largely, people were using IQ tests till they came out of their ears, you know, that the assumption was this was something you had or you didn't have. So for him to come along and say, no, actually we can influence that in the way that we interact with children, in the way that we talk to children, you know, was quite a big thing then. It's not now. We know about, you know, brain plasticity, don't we? We've got theories like mindset that talk about, you know, how we think about ourselves and learning make a difference to how we learn. So things have moved on. But what what Feuerstein gave us and kind of what's key to kind of most of the dynamic assessment approaches that, you know, I've just mentioned and that you'll be working with is this theory of mediated learning experience. And again, like I say, I'm not going to go into great detail about it, but just to say that if you've ever tried to engage with the theory, it can seem quite complex, and it's certainly very multifaceted. You're thinking about your interactions with a child in an assessment situation or a learning situation. That could also be a classroom, you know, in very sort of specific and multi-layered ways. But central to his theory, if you remember back, was this idea that there are what he called 11 parameters, or if an easier word to think of is perhaps qualities or aspects of mediation. So 11 different kind of aspects of an interaction that a mediator might draw upon to help shape and form a child's thinking. And that these of these 11, there are 3 that are essential or what he deemed as being essential for an interaction to be called mediated, so that we've helped the child to make sense of the world differently by employing these 3 essential features. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about in what I called the what, why, where model. That I'll talk to you about that in just a second. But just to say that all of these aspects of this mediated conversation or interaction that you might have, they all focus on how you help a child to structure their thinking, the kind of structural aspects of thinking or cognition, or they focus on the kind of emotional, motivational aspects, the affect, how you feel about learning, how you feel about yourself, what makes you actually do it, what drives you to be able to engage in a learning situation. Thinking about this kind of cognition and affect, or like structure of thinking and emotional aspect of learning, are kind of core to the what you're trying to achieve in mediation. Do I need to support how they're thinking or how they're feeling about the learning? That's what we're trying to think. And again, if you've ever done any training in CBT, what are you doing in CBT? You're thinking about cognitions and you're thinking about feelings, you know, and it's no different in dynamic assessment. There's huge parallels, in my opinion. Okay, there's other aspects of mediation you might think of. So this is very sort of a general approach to mediation, and there are obviously some sort of aspects to mediation that are very task specific. According to what dynamic assessment task you're doing, you might ask particular questions or focus on particular aspects of cognition. You need to know what the test is testing to know what you might need to mediate and focus on. There's sort of aspects of intensity, how intense your mediation is. Do you need to give a child loads and loads of support to the point of even perhaps having to get your hand over their hand to help them write, versus actually just a few prompting questions to focus their attention can suddenly sort of free up thinking and direct thinking in the right direction. And as an EP, thinking about how intense, how hard am I having to work at this to help this child learn, gives you an idea of perhaps how much support they're going to need in the classroom. So that could be quite helpful. But also, I'd really encourage you to think about mediation both within your assessment, but outside of it too. You're kind of bridging your assessment elsewhere. So what are other people doing? You know, what mediation skills could you help other people around the child engage in, develop further? So I'm going to come back to these 3 essential features and show you how you can have a simple way of remembering these when you're doing your mediation in dynamic assessment tasks. I just need a quick drink of water, excuse me. So this is what I call the what, why, where model of mediation. And the astute among you will notice that I used it when we started the session, and I tried to model it for you. So what first I said from the theory, his words are here in the black. He said that for an interaction to be mediated, it had to be intentional and reciprocal. It had to have meaning. It had to be relevant to the person. They had to understand why they were doing what they were doing. And you also had to be able to, I don't know if you can see that one, it's not very clear on my screen. You also had to be able to see how it linked to other areas of your life. So how the interaction that you were immediately engaged in, the learning experience you were immediately engaged with, bridged or linked to other parts of life. So how is what you're doing in the here and now relevant beyond this situation? So I call that the kind of what, why, where approach. Whenever we're doing mediation in a dynamic assessment, whenever we're doing a dynamic assessment, we need to think about this model at the beginning of our assessment and throughout. We need to be really clear with the learner what we're doing, focusing their learning on what we're going to do within that session. And linked to that why, what's in it for the learner? This is about the motivation, getting them motivated to engage, explaining what we think the purpose of this session that we're doing with them is. And I always advocate being really honest. This is why I'm here today. This is what I've been asked to do. And I will have scripts that I use at the beginning that will explain, that people have asked me to help them think about this child and asked me to help them think about how they learn best and what might help them in the future. And that I'm hoping through doing the activities that I've bought, and I would be straight up about what they were, that it was going to help me understand more about the way this child learned. And that was going to mean that I would be able to go back and talk to the teachers or the parents or carers, whoever was working the child, about what would help them most. Now, I expect most of you do that anyway, or something like it. And I'm saying to you, if you're doing it, you're already mediating learning, and just be very conscious and definite about doing it. And sometimes you have to work harder at one of those aspects than others and take the time to do that. So for some children, you might need to adapt how you present what you're going to do. And I know loads of you will have done that. So you'll take in a piece of paper and you'll write down, and they can tick off if you know that they're going to need more support to understand what you're doing. Some learners need more time to think about the why, the buy-in, getting them to engage, what's in it for you, so finding out about how they feel about learning, how they feel about different aspects of learning. Sometimes I know with learners that I work with in SEMH settings, this can be the really difficult bit, getting them to engage. So spending a bit of time finding out about them is good mediation practice. Tell me about, what's going on for you at school. How do you feel about learning? And sometimes from that I might sort of change what I'm going to do in the session. I'll say, oh, I've heard you don't really like doing that, let's try this instead. So you're trying to get that motivation, that buy-in. And then the kind of where, on the kind of general level, where is this going to be useful, as in me going back to stuff, but you also might come back to that at the end of a session of dynamic assessment. This is what we've done today. We've done the complex figure drawing. You had to look really carefully at how the shapes fitted together. You had to take your time. These are skills you're going to need when you're doing reading, because you need to look carefully at how the words come together. It might be something that you're doing in maths. So you would think perhaps more specifically relating to what the kind of the assessment tool was that you'd used, about linking that, where is this going to be useful in the future. So I would also argue to you that you can use that model when you're talking to staff. I've used that with teaching assistants to help them think about how they introduce activities, how they get people engaged with activities. And I find that calling it the what, why, where model is a lot easier than talking about the kind of original kind of theoretical constructs and labels that Firstein used. So that's one tool. The other tool that I very quickly whiz through, because I'm just aware of time, if I can get the slide to change, is a tool that I've used with EPs to sort of evaluate their practice. I said to you that, as I say, getting good at mediation or feeling confident with mediation, it needs time, it needs opportunities to be able to reflect on practice. So I would hugely encourage you, wherever possible, to try and video, and as excruciating as being videoed is, video your dynamic assessment sessions. And this is a tool to really use in reflection and supervision, to think about how you're incorporating different aspects of mediation theory into your dynamic assessment work. And it might be something you use just on your own. It might be something you use with a supervisor, ideally someone who's more confident in or has more experience in using dynamic assessment might be helpful. But the idea is that you can use this to kind of look at each sort of phase of your assessment practice and where mediation might come in. So as I've already said to you, that what, why, where model might well sort of be part of the beginning part of your session. How you set up the session is part of the mediated interaction. How the child understands what they're there to do and that they're motivated, engaged. You might, sometimes you have to spend all your time doing that bit, or focusing on that bit. That's appropriate if it's what's required in the session. So this is the kind of the what, why, where kind of bits that I've just spoken to you about. And then during your assessment, the sorts of skills that you'd be using and the sorts of qualities that you would have to your practice. And again, I bet you're doing a lot of these already. It's promoting. So one aspect will be promoting this kind of positive relationship that you were conveying through the way you're talking to the child, that you're not there testing them, checking whether they're getting this right at all. You're there to work together. And some children are going to need more mediation to feel okay with that than others. So reassuring them, don't worry if you get stuck, I can help you, you can ask me for help, or let's look at it together. All those kinds of comments that you might use that are conveying that sense that you're here together. That's mediation. Probably the kind of most sort of challenging area is this second one here about the questions that you use to really promote that kind of strategic or logical thinking. And that sort of links to that idea of intensity as well. Just using a few simple questions, can you help this learner think differently? And yeah, we could do a whole 20 minutes, hour probably on different questions. But again, tapping into everything from things like CBT about the kind of Socratic questioning techniques, looking at all the literature, and actually a lot of this is just good teaching and learning practice. A lot of these kind of aspects of mediation theory are now sort of subsumed into what we know to be good teaching practice. And sometimes, the odd question, tell me what you see, would be a very light touch, or how do these things go together? You're focusing on the process. But occasionally you have to give quite direct instruction and information that the child's lacking, noticing when they need you to tell them something because it's not there and they don't have that information is also good mediation. Giving feedback as you move through. I noticed the way you did that. It was lovely, but being really not saying, I noticed the way you did that. I noticed the way you looked at that carefully, being very specific. And again, there's a huge literature now on feedback. Teachers are becoming more and more aware of this, and this is what we're aiming for in our dynamic assessment practice. It might be that you're kind of having to work on regulation, that you're having to sort of support their self-esteem, that you're having to offer reassurance and help them regulate how they're feeling about their learning, and really trying to understand how they feel and where that's coming from. And there's just a sort of, the bottom one here is making sure whatever assessment tool you're using, how it should be used, that you've got some knowledge of what the manual says about how to use it, or you've had some training. And just to come back to that, sometimes there's quite specific guidance. If you're using something about like the ACS-FS and Carol Litz's tools, there's quite specific guidance about mediation within those. It's a different approach, in fact. At the end of the session, coming back to that kind of reflection, summarising what they've done, and being able to link what you've done in the here and now. And that might be as general as me going back to your teachers to talk to them about what I found out about you today, see if we can help them think about that in the classroom. Or it might be something quite specific that you can say to the child, actually remember when you're working next time to always look carefully before you answer, or stop and think, or check and change. It might be that you're giving them a piece of advice that they might be able to go on and use. Okay, I'm aware I think I've gone over my 20 minutes, and I'm going to quickly stop share and see if I can get to some of your questions. I don't think there's any there. That's okay. Just double check the chat. Right. Okay, so I've got a question here. I'm sorry, just can't read and speak at the same time, I'm afraid. Okay, so this is the million-dollar question here. How do you move away from an IQ psychometric score-based approach to being able to have a dynamic assessment approach? Well, there's no simple answer to that. I think you have to have a very strong philosophy within your psychological service. It has to be supported by management. And you need a management team in your service that is talking to those that are requiring these scores, about the validity of them, the relevance of them, the usefulness. And I think actually if you're very confident in your dynamic assessment practice, that's easier. If you can confidently say, look, I can give you much better recommendations that are much more linked to classroom learning than I can if I give you this score. What's difficult about the score is if you're in an area where resources are decided on scores. And there, I think it's a kind of helping sort of move people's expectations away from, actually, is an IQ score the most valid? There are myriads of arguments about why they're not. It could be that if people do need a score, that you get them to rely a bit more on teacher assessment, on national curriculum levels, which I know are a lot more woolly than they used to be, but are much more sort of ecologically valid. The teachers saying they're 2 years behind. What more information do you need? Whether they can score high on an IQ test or not is neither here nor there if they're that far behind in their curriculum learning. So there's not a simple answer, but it's about having a strong belief that this is going to be better, feeling confident in your practice, and helping others understand how you think this will give you better advice and better approach. I don't know if that helps. I'm sure everybody has come across that problem. So another question here, which DA tool do you find gives you the most information? Okay, well, in my training that I give, the course that the trainees have at the Tavistock Clinic, I always say to them, you need to do more than one dynamic assessment. You need to use more than one dynamic assessment tool to be able to give you the full range of information that you need. So again, it depends what age group you're working with, but I advocate with the trainees using kind of what I call a basic battery. It's an idea that I got from Ruth Deutsch. She talked about that first. So if anyone's been trained by her, you might be familiar with that. And I would generally tend to use the complex figure drawing, the 16-word memory test, and either the Ravens matrices or the CCPAM, which is one of David Zuriel's tests that focuses on reasoning. If you use those three, you've done, tests which give you, the opportunity to look at a range of cognitive skills. Trouble is, if you only do one, you can't really comment on a full range of cognitive skills. You need a really good sort of knowledge and understanding of what the model of cognition is that you're using and what the different tests can sort of help you think about. So and I would always advocate as well, and this is sometimes controversial, you have to do dynamic assessment over more than one session. You need 2 sessions at least to do a good job. Your hypothesis testing, arguably it's difficult to do any decent assessment in one session anyway. But using the approach that I'm really favouring at the moment, and I'm trying to develop in my own practice, is using a kind of much more formulation based, so that you're kind of using not just the dynamic assessment information that you're using, you're making sure it's really well integrated with kind of observation material, and the results of any standardised testing that schools hold as well. So. Yes, sorry, waffly answer to a short question. I have to say, because I think it's past now, that the tool that I showed you for evaluating your practice, I think Sarah and Nicole said they were going to put that on their website, so you can download that when I've sent it to them. If you're very welcome to use it. And I think they've also put my contact details on the chat. If you want to ask me anything about anything I've said today, or anything about dynamic assessment, I can talk about it all day if you want to, and I'd be very happy to speak to you. So thank you for listening, and I hope that there's been something there that's useful. And please, go out there, use dynamic assessment more. and, you know, develop your confidence with the approach. You won't regret it, I'm sure. Thank you very much.